burnout is a real risk for high-achieving individuals who push themselves too hard, too intense to pursue their true north. And therefore, the self-care is very important for them to make sure that they don't get into the burnout.
Do you think you're able to fully appreciate the value of self-care if you have not actually experienced burnout for yourself? Welcome to the Game of Impossible. We are a father and son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. That in last week's episode, we talked about whether or not a passion should be turned into a profession. And in that discussion, I think we arrived at the fact that you ultimately can't really play the game of the impossible without a passion for the thing that you're doing or the problem that you or your organization is trying to solve. Because passion is ultimately what drives the repeated action that is required over a long time to truly see results. You know, I've been thinking about that and wondering at what point does maybe passion turn into obsession? Is that necessarily a bad thing? You can obsess over something which can really help actually giving you that initial boost of intensity. But is there a point at which obsession with something becomes maybe unhealthy, especially if you have other responsibilities, if you are a parent or if you have a spouse to also look after? What are some initial thoughts?
Yeah, passion and obsession are the other side of the coin. It's just like your strength is also your weakness. And exactly your strength is also your weakness. So let me just dissect that and ask the question, what are my thoughts on passion and when it becomes obsession? It becomes an obsession where you're not clear about your true north. If you're very vague about what you're trying to do, then obviously you do not know where the boundaries are drawn between what is a passion to achieve the true north and when it is no longer achieving the true north and it goes into what is called an obsession. Because you're going into a territory that's negative, that's very confused, mess, and you are not really sure about what you're trying to drive at. So I think it's very important to have the clear true north definition nailed down in very specific measures that you can now know. It guides you with regards to the things that you're doing and not do. Because if you are not clear about the boundaries of where you're going and where you're not going, then I think the passion can then quickly deteriorate into an obsession.
How do you know when you have crossed the line into obsession? Maybe for you personally, I would say that you and I are both kind of generally obsessive people. I mean, maybe to use the word a bit more loosely, but in the things that we enjoy doing. Last week, we talked about our hobbies. We even had a bit of a jam session. In the area of guitars, for example, you have clearly shown some obsessive behavior, especially when you were initially learning how to build guitars. I think every time I saw you, you were either tinkering on the guitar, sometimes at odd hours, or you might just be watching endless YouTube videos at night on building guitars. So maybe we're a little predisposed towards the obsessive. How do you kind of self-audit and recognize when maybe something has become maybe a little bit of an obsession for you, and how do you then pare down?
Let me give the exact story about my journey into guitar building during the pandemic. During the pandemic, Leon, I had nothing to do. I was stuck at home. I figuring out this is a time for me to pivot into a second curve and do something I'm passionate about guitar. So during that period of time, I was practically every single day looking at material and videos on how people were building guitars. And I was obsessive in really looking at Reverb, the Reverb platform, where people are selling guitars all around the world, thousands of guitars. I can tell you during that 2-year period, during the pandemic, I know a lot about guitars, all sorts of guitars. I even stumbled into guitars that were built in the 1960s, an example being Taisco. Taisco is a Japanese company that produced guitars in the 60s. And so I found...
Not Tesco's, by the way, the grocers, not to be confused with Tesco's.
Not Tesco, Teisco. So they produce those guitars, and I found out a lot about them. And I then Google and Reverb, I found people who kept some of those old guitars. I decided to follow the discussion there, and I was really obsessed with the guitar. I ended up buying 3 of them actually, different colors. When I took them, of course I have to change the pickup because they're no longer functional. Some of the frets on the on the guitars also needed to be changed. I changed the entire fretboard, and then the cabling inside there, the electronics has to be changed as well. A lot of things has to be changed. Some of the woods have cracked, so I had to repair those as well. So, but you see, when I was doing that, if my true north was very clear, I was just going to spend my time doing something I really enjoyed, I had a passion for. I was not clear about the true north. The true north was, I was very muddled about it. But I kind of allowed myself to go into it. It's like the drifter. And I told myself, deliberately, I'm going to drift because I got plenty of time. And as I went down that path, I started building so many guitars, and I was tinkering with them, and I didn't like this pickup. I removed that pickup, put another thing. I didn't like the soldering. I changed that. I didn't like the neck. I swapped them. Some of my guitars were Frankenstein. It's a mixture of different guitars put together, and people call it hybrid guitars, but I call it Frankenstein because, so many parts are put together. Then I paused for a little while after a year or so. I said, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? Because
what made you pause and ask that question?
Because I realized that I've accumulated many of them. I then asked the question, what is the distinctive thing about this guitar that tells it apart from the other guitars? Why was I really making those tinkering and those changes to the guitars? Then I realized that because I wasn't clear about the true north, the measure of what constitute what I really was looking for, I was just drifting. And so I decided then to focus on a few things. So now I concluded to myself, what is it that I really like about the guitar that I want to do? I said, for me, I really like the guitar that has a Telecaster neck.
Right.
And I like a guitar that has the body of a Stratocaster. I like that. But I discovered recently the best pickup sound that I really like were gold foil pickups. And that's not the conventional pickups that people put onto guitars.
Yeah, and if you'd like to see an example of this very setup, you can actually go to last week's episode 26, where we took 2 of these guitars for a spin. One was exactly as you described, the one that I played. But then we recently got you a birthday present, which has a slightly different, maybe a swapped mechanism, where it is the body and even a headstock of a Strat, but with the pickup setting of a Telecaster and even the neck.
So that's a hybrid guitar. So I was then able to reflect on what I was doing. So I then concluded, okay, if that was the case, why don't I stop all the other things I was doing? I focus on building exactly what I want with this specification, and I said stop there. And so I then have been able to produce the guitar that I believe are the one that suited what I really wanted to do. That was my true north. I believe I have achieved what I wanted out of a guitar, rather than aimlessly, obsessively going through a drifting mode of adventure. So now I then put a stop to it because I then achieved the ultimate that I really like.
Yeah.
In fact, the guitar that you have is exactly that guitar.
Yeah.
Because that guitar has Telecaster neck, it has a Strat body, and also it has an F-hole. It's almost a fake F-hole, and 2 of the best pickups, the gold foil pickups, are installed onto it. I really like that guitar. So because I've done that, I said, okay, I now achieve more or less what I really want. I now put the boundaries on it not moving into the door of obsession.
Do you think that it is, obviously, whenever we look at something in hindsight, you often hear a lot of people, very successful people as well, say things like, I wish I had spent more time with, let's say, family, or been more intentional in spending time with my friends. With hindsight, you can say things like, maybe in the past I have figured out how I could have been able to work smarter. And then they will draw reference to their current rhythm now. Like now I'm actually able to block out X amount of time to do X number of tasks. But sometimes I think of those, I see those comments and I wonder, would that approach have worked in the previous context? Because obviously now in a position of leadership, you have way more responsibilities, but there are certain day-to-day tasks that now you no longer have to do anymore. Some of the more kind of tedious stuff which you now have the ability to delegate to another person or an entire team under you. So I guess the simple question is, sometimes do we feel that it is actually necessary to have those initial early seasons of, let's just for the sake of argument, call it being obsessive. Because I think Reed Hastings, the CEO or one of the former CEOs of Netflix, he said that, he said the same thing. He said, now in hindsight, I think I really don't see the point in working myself to death like this. But then he admitted, but maybe if I look back, had I not put in the hours to do that, I probably would not have given myself the luxury and the breathing space to now be able to determine how I want to spend my life. And then he even said, I might even encourage, if you are still in the early stages of your career, I would actually say, make the most out of that time to really go for it so that you can get the freedom later on.
Sure.
It gives you that head start. So do you also feel that it is kind of sometimes necessary to go through that initial season of obsession?
Yeah, I think that's very, very good point, Leon. People who are trying to get to something that is the unknown, uncharted waters. A lot of the game, the impossible, are actually going into uncharted territories. So the concept of going through what is called divergence. You go and diverge, that means you explore many different things that you're doing, try many different things, take many different routes, make zigzags. So this idea of doing a divergence and convergence is a very important idea, because if you are not clear about your true north, then you become completely lost. Many years ago, James Michener wrote a very thick book called The Drifters. And in that idea, there were, I think, a few characters that were mentioned in the book when he described the idea of the drifters. People who drift, that means aimlessly drifting into the sea without a true north of where they're going. That's when you have diverged, and the divergence never converge. If that divergence never converge, then you are not achieving a true north. So I think what you need to do now, it is good to go and then diverge. That means look at many different ways and vantage points. You explore the innovation in that, but then you have to converge. That's when you then stop the obsession from being drifting out without a purpose, without a clear goal where you're heading.
Yeah, I think it's in that season of divergence. It might not be a divergence in terms of not really having a sense of focus on what you're doing. It could be a divergence in terms of maybe not being clear on an objective, but certainly on the discipline that you are trying to, that you are in, whether it's in the job that you're doing or maybe something else, a hobby that you're trying to really, really get good at. There could be a divergence in terms of maybe a lack of clarity on what's the objective that you're trying to go for. But back to the original question of is that initial period of obsessiveness important? I think what is good about it is when you become so obsessive about something in the early stages, there's a point at which you think so much about the thing that it becomes ingrained in you. And I think when you spend that time being very focused on that thing, and it becomes so ingrained in how you process information around you, I think that is the thing that allows you to diverge a little bit, because as you diverge, you are so focused on the thing that actually you're able to find connections in, let's say, in other disciplines, you'll be able to find connections that will help you get better at that one thing that you're trying to do. And it might be completely outside of the discipline, it might be in something else, but it gives you a bit more of a vocabulary or an awareness, which can help you then come back, because your point is that it has to at some point converge once again. Maybe what are some ways that have helped you? Are there practical ways that you can begin to then say, okay, how can we converge? I mean, you gave the example of
Yeah.
your like guitars, but maybe
Yeah.
in a work context, how do you encourage those under your care, your teams, to be able to then find that point of convergence again?
Yeah, a few things. Number one, they must agree collectively what's the measure of true north. And we talked about it ad nauseum in one of our episodes. It's so important for the team to be very clear about the measure of success. And if that's not clear, then you can't move to the second point, which is about ruthless prioritization on activities that matter, because these activities are the ones that help you achieve your true north.
Yeah. And would you say that you're only able to ascertain that if you have done enough of the thing, and sometimes even done enough of the wrong thing?
Yeah. In a sense, when we talked a lot about the iterative way of doing it, problem solving recursively. So sometimes the period when you go and deliberately go through the diversion, that means many different pathways you're exploring. In the many different pathways that you explore, you realize some things don't work. Some things will work, some things need to be modified. But you then begin to converge and pick the ones that you're going to pick, drop the balls you're not going to catch. And so then you're really focusing in converging towards the true north. The clarity of true north is important. Number two, as I said, prioritizing on activities that are really important to achieve that. So the things you will not do, the things you focus on, very sharply focusing on what really matters is very, very important. And the other aspect, the practical aspect, is that time management and resource allocation. That means you really have to make sure that you put everybody together in a way that you schedule the time. Because when you have a team, if people are not doing it in a manner that's either sequential or in parallel, you don't find efficiency in the way things are being done as a team. You need to make them click. That's why the 3 feet programming is very important that we talked about before. Well, the other thing that you realize in doing all this is it's easier said than done, but in implementation, there are still a lot of problems. And so the practical aspect is the solving problem recursively during the implementation. When you implement it, not the first thing that you do is not going to hit a success right away, because the very next day you discover there's some faults in it, the structural issues associated with the customer feedback negative about the product. Then you have to come back and try to resolve this. That means problem solving recursively as you go along. Then you will see that people really like it. As you see, then you say, okay, now I got it. I really have reached a point that people do like this. But remember always, maybe the competition will allow a good run rate about a year before they catch up with you, because then they think you're making a huge head start with your product, and the competition will be watching you, and they will be making innovation to beat you. So you have to be all the time on your toes to figure out how to go and do it. BlackBerry. When BlackBerry came about there, it was a Canadian company called RIM. When RIM came out with this highly innovative thing, it was a craze. But then the guys they just believed that there are two things that was very important for BlackBerry for their competitive advantage. One was the keyboard. Everybody was raving about their keyboard. That's one. The second thing that was important was they felt that they were focusing only on the business segments. But what Apple did when they came out to introduce it, they said, well, we're going to put up iPhone, the smartphone, for everybody, not just the business people. And so they said, we're going to break the monopoly that people focusing on the physical keyboard. That's the most important aspect. We don't need a keyboard, the physical keyboard. So the folks in BlackBerry kind of poo-pooed it, because they said, this is distinct. The business segment is distinct from the ordinary people that were doing it. They didn't realize that the point was the two of the things, there was intersection between them. When they first started, the total revenue in the second year of BlackBerry, if I recall, was $2 billion US dollars revenue. Within a year and a half or so, iPhone really took it to the tail. 20 billion revenue. Then, of course, BlackBerry died. So the point was this, why I came out, that was, they were very clear, they were very successful. They didn't realize that you must not stop innovating, because the competition be watching you. They will tell you that we're going to beat you, and that we know where your strengths are. We're going to get a product that will beat you on the competition. That's how you must continue to innovate if you really want to stay the course of achieving your game or impossible. It's a great pity. I was a big fan of BlackBerry. I had many
too.
versions of them. It's a great pity when they died. I really felt so bad. I almost felt like, today, I put up a notice outside my door, due to lack of enthusiasm, today is cancelled. That kind of feeling, that because I realized that they were already dead. It's a great pity, and I really love their keyboard. And it took me some time to bury that and said I'm now going to move to iPhone.
Yeah. So, I think so far we've said that obviously passion is important to drive your game of the impossible. And maybe sometimes even certain periods where that passion maybe veers into the obsession could also be healthy, provided we have a clear sense of what we are trying to achieve and we bring things back to a kind of a convergence point where there's a sense of focus. But we're only really able to sometimes figure out what the focus is once we have diverted a little bit, gone through that season of divergence and tried stuff, maybe failed a few times. The thing you mentioned earlier was then you talked about competition, right? And the fact that we need to be aware of, let's say, just in a business context, or even if you're even in sports, to be aware of what the competition is doing, to not fall behind, always be one step ahead. Now, all of these things, I think what it points to is intensity.
Yeah.
Right? And so with intensity, if again the caveat here is we're talking about achieving the impossible. We're not saying that a lack of intensity is a bad thing, but just through the lens of wanting to achieve the impossible, it seems like intensity is kind of the secret ingredient here. But sustaining a certain level of intensity, surely that can't be too good in the long run. How do we ensure that we can still be intense in the things that we are doing without burning out?
Yeah. You cannot do intensity with too many things. If you are doing too many things and you want to be intense in all those things you're trying to do, you will never succeed. You will definitely get into a burnout. So my view today is that prioritize on a few things, one or two things that you really focus on, and then you put intensity. You will not get burnout because you're not doing 10 things. You're doing 2 things, but you're putting your energy into those 2 things. That's what the laser sharp focus. Focus and intensity are very important components. You can't have one and without the other. Because if you want to have both of them, you have 100 things, you want to put intensity, I think in 5 days, you'll probably burn out. You can't do that. And my argument today is that if you want to say, how do you make sure that intensity and focus can live together, it can only live together through prioritization. If you don't prioritize, you cannot have focus and intensity in the same room. And then, therefore, you will then get into a situation of burnout. There is no burnout, in my view, if you are focusing on a few things. Take a look at people, top athletes. It's very clear Usain Bolt, he only wanted 2 disciplines, 100 meters, 200 meters. He didn't even want to do long jump because that was what Carl Lewis did, because he said, if I focus also on the long jump, and then I will have a lot of injuries in the process of doing that, and I may not be able to put up a world record that will be sustainable over a long period of time. And that was his true north. And so I think focus is very important. The more focused you are in it, the more you then put intensity into the very narrow area that you're going to work on. And if you do that, frankly speaking, Leon, I really cannot see how people can complain. They say, oh, I can't put intensity. Yeah, because we are doing too many things. You're juggling too many balls.
Prioritization, I think that's good. That's good in helping you when you are in a season of intensity to navigate it strategically and well. But I think maybe the other side of the coin is also being strategic and intentional about rest.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting one because you can very easily end up allowing rest to take you to maybe another season of drifting. You can end up drifting in the rest. But you talked about athletes earlier, and if you look at how the best athletes in the world perform, yes, there's a huge amount of discipline, there's a huge amount of sacrifice, a massive amount of intensity in their, not just the training, but how their entire lives are basically shaped around the thing that they're trying to pursue. Not just your diet, but all sorts. Lifestyle changes completely. But actually, in that same vein, if you look deeply enough, we talk so much about the actual grueling training that happens. But actually, what's maybe not so talked about is the fact that actually in that, one of the disciplines also is rest and recovery. They're extremely religious about their recovery, their discipline of recovery. For example, making sure that they sleep X amount of hours, making sure that they go for regular kind of physio, deep tissue massages. I mean, the amount of stuff that some of these athletes go through as part of their recovery protocol is quite insane. So actually, there is a real, if you like, there's also a discipline of rest, discipline of recovery. And it's only because they are recovered well that they're able to then perform optimally. So maybe for life in general, I think there's quite a strong case also for the need to be able to pair or navigate seasons where you are intentional and being very intense with seasons or pockets of rest as well.
Right.
But then we know that, but maybe in a corporate setting, sometimes I wonder if rest can be seen as maybe putting someone at a bit of a disadvantage. I mean, let's take, for example, if you were to, and we have a practice of doing this in PEMANDU, of when people go on really long and very intense engagements, we encourage people to take longer times off, and some people go and take longer sabbaticals as well. You are currently on a sabbatical currently.
One whole year.
On a whole year. It's a year is a long time to be on a break. I wonder maybe more so for someone who's maybe in the more nascent stages of their career. Could something like that, taking an extended time off, could that put someone at a disadvantage? Purely looking at it through the lens of corporate, climbing up the corporate ladder. Do you think that puts someone at a disadvantage?
Yeah. Taking a sabbatical, let's say a year-long sabbatical, it has its pros and cons. And there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is, as you rightly pointed out, there's an opportunity for rest and rejuvenation. If you've been so tired, you really need the time. And you also during that time, you have enough time for reflection. There are 3 R's there. There's rest, rejuvenation for your personal development, and also reflection. This is a time you make corrective actions that are needed for you to go and do this. And so these are very important things that you're doing. You're going to develop yourself into a specific area, but you must be clear why you're doing it. The why is very important. If you're not clear about why you're taking a sabbatical, then it's also a problem, because the positive aspect of why you're doing must outweigh the negative aspect, because there are cons associated with it. Number one, the cons is that there will be a career disruption. You go taking 1 year out. When you're taking 1 year out, the company that you're leaving, they cannot just leave the vacuum. They're going to distribute the work, or they might hire someone to go and do it. So you will have a career disruption. The second thing, you may lose out, because things develop in the organization. There are new skills, new competencies, new adventure that they're going through. You will miss out on those things. And third area, you may lose your salary. There's financial impact that's negatively as a result of you taking 1 year sabbatical without a job, and therefore you are going to do it. I come back to the point that why are you doing it? If your true north for the sabbatical is clear, and then you know that the positives far outweigh the negatives, then it's okay, because life is a trade-off, Leon. You can't do everything under the sun and expect to catch all of them. Life is always a trade-off between what you regard as important, what you regard as the trade-off. And the trade-off, the financial impact that's negative, losing out on what's happening in the firm. And the third aspect is that you are going to make sure that the career disruption will bring an uncertain outcome for you upon your return, when you do return. So once you're clear about that, then you go ahead and do. Because you know these are negative and will be far outweighed by the positives. If you're not clear in your mind about the why you're doing it, then it's going to be a problematic sabbatical that you're going to take.
Yeah, I think that's important, establishing the why. And in the same way that we are intentional about goal setting in our work,
Yeah.
I think there is real merit in also being intentional about goal setting and outcome setting for our times of rest as well, even if it's just for a shorter period. When we are focused on a particular outcome, you mentioned that negates, maybe I won't use the word negates, but it offsets the disappointments. And the reason why I don't want to use the word negates is I think also we just want to set realistic expectations that even though let's say in a time of sabbatical, you have achieved the things that you wanted to achieve, okay, now you return back to your workplace. Maybe there are things that have changed. So you return to your role, but perhaps either the role has changed slightly, or maybe there is, like you say, a period of readjusting just because you've just been off your game for a bit. That doesn't take away the fact that it's still going to be difficult to deal with those feelings, maybe of frustration.
You mentioned how athletes get themselves, fixed to recover, and I call it self-care. The analogy in an aeroplane, if you go into aeroplane, the first thing about the oxygen mask is then they will tell you to put the oxygen mask on yourself before helping others. So in anything that we do, when we are focusing laser sharp, prioritizing and putting so much intensity on it, we must find time to take care of our whole health. That's why the idea of taking some time out when it's needed, not just a whole lot at the end of the year. It could be very periodic throughout the year to recharge your battery. And that's very, very important. Otherwise, if you don't have self-care, because self-care is the real engine of success. That is the self-care. And if you don't do the self-care in it, your intensity will turn towards burnout. People describe burnout is a real risk for high-achieving individuals who push themselves too hard, too intense to pursue their true north. And therefore, the self-care is very important for them to make sure that they don't get into the burnout.
Do you think you're able to fully appreciate the value of self-care if you have not actually experienced burnout for yourself? And I ask this as someone who has experienced burnout before in the past. It's something that I used to brush aside as being kind of a very woke thing to talk about. And I felt that it was maybe something, a word that was too loosely thrown around until I experienced it for myself. And having experienced it, this is where, number one, you begin to appreciate the severity of it. But then also for me personally, having already experienced it, I now have... I can now recognize the signs of when I might be heading towards a trajectory of burnout because I've experienced it myself. And so for me personally, I kind of look back and think, maybe if it wasn't for experiencing that episode, I wouldn't really have the tools to be able to spot it. But then also, if I do end up at some point, for whatever reason, getting myself back into that kind of hole of burnout, then the tools to get out of it, with having already come out of it once, that gives me the ability to do it again if that ever happens to me. So then sometimes, again, there's that question of like, it's very easy to say, these are things we can do to avoid. But realistically, sometimes can you truly achieve the game of the impossible without actually having made those mistakes? We talk about failure and the fact that we need to fail often and to fail well in order to finally hit the thing that is right. So sometimes even something like burnout, I wonder, is there, if we don't experience any of these things, if we live the perfect life, right, with no mistakes because we've calculated every single thing, will we truly have the kind of life experience and be able to bring a sense of nuance and real in-depth experience in the things that we do if it weren't for having, messed up that one time, if it weren't for experiencing burnout?
I think so. I think people who are pursuing game are impossible. I do believe that they are walking on the edge. There are people who don't sit here and they're sitting here on the edge. You are on the precipice of burnout. At the same time, you are pushing the intensity to the level that you have never explored and seen before. And so you will experience many symptoms of burnout. So that's why it's important for reflection. People who are doing game or impossible must take time to reflect, looking at themselves in the mirror, looking at the signs and symptoms, whether they are now really almost at the edge of falling from the cliff. And so not just self-reflection, but getting feedback from others as well. Because sometimes you can't see what about yourself. You just are blind to the things that are happening to yourself, the stress that you're going through, the cynicism that's going on, the negativities that's coming out from your very language as well, from the laughter galore was what my old boss once said, is the laughter galore at the expense of other people. And that's a real sign of burnout. That means you're laughing at other people's expense. You're very cynical about it. And you are also very negative in your thoughts and your language that you use. And everything is bad because you see everything as being negative. You no longer see the positive in everything. You're critical about other people. You're blaming others for the faults rather than looking for solutions, looking for remedies. So if you always are reflecting and looking at that, you can avoid falling down the cliff, because really it's a necessity when you are pursuing the game than possible. You are close to the edge. And you're close to the edge. You smell and you feel burnout at very close range, because that's what it is. You can talk to anybody. I mean, really, we talked about passion and obsession. Listen to all the YouTube videos and everybody that talks about Amazon. And Amazon is a company that is really on the edge, If you Google the average number of years that people stay in the same company, it's incredibly short. I can't even remember how many. It was less than a year. Many of them quit because they are operating on the edge, close on the edge. So people don't stay very long there because it's tough, but they bring in new people. And so Jeff Bezos is a nasty fellow. It's a very difficult boss, extremely difficult, because he is operating on the edge. Extreme. He's an extreme example of someone that's really very nasty and it sits on the edge. It takes no prisoners because he pushes people right to the limit. The passion for him, the obsession that's turned into the passion and obsession, he's obsessed and passionate about customers. Every big meetings they have in Amazon, there's the empty chair that they put out there. And the empty chair, it reminds everybody the customer is sitting on that empty chair, listening to our discussion, listening to the things that we're trying to develop, listening to all the things that we're going to do that's actually going to be bad for customers' experience. And thou shall never do it, because don't even open your mouth to talk about things that are negatively impacting customer experience, because a customer is sitting in this chair listening to us. And he takes no prisoners when it comes down to that. So I think the guy is operating on the edge. And that's why the tenure for people living within an Amazon is relatively short. I'll check it actually. Yeah. It says employees stay in Amazon for an average of 2.7 years. They don't last even 3 years there. That's the average, because they are operating on the edge. Extremely tough.
Do you think that, some countries like in Sweden, they have a 4-day work policy? Do you think that things like that, while we're talking on the subject of rest to maybe offset intensity, do you think that a 4-day work policy is helpful to an organization? Can you still be productive? There are a lot of arguments for it that say that it's just a matter of being more. It forces you basically to be more intentional with your time. What do you think?
Yeah, to me, you can do it, but it's always a question of productivity. You can spend 7 days in a week working, but you're not productive. You're not effective in the things that you do. The output that you produce is a very average output. You will find a lot of people, in students as well. There are people who spend a lot of time studying, but they don't study smartly. So the outcome, the grades are not as good as those folks are very smart in the way that they study. They don't spend so much time doing it, but they are very smart, they're very clever in doing it. Then the outcomes is better. So I think productivity and being efficient in what you're doing, we can say that someone who spends only 4-day week can be better than someone that spend 7-day week. But if everything is the same in life, that means, of course, nothing is exactly the same. If you take the principle of, ceteris paribus, everything held equal, obviously the person that spend 5 days is better than 4. But it can change depending on productivity. The Swiss are people who are very clear about measuring productivity in the way they look at the product. The product must be so good that it beat the competition. That's why the Swiss watches, nobody beat them because they are very, very clear about what the measure of success is on the watches, the precision of the watches, etc. And frankly speaking, if you can do that and within 4 days, that's the way to go. I mean, life is more than just work, Leon. So I think people must learn how to do work without putting so much long hours into it. And if you're smart at doing it, you don't need to spend so much time doing this. And that's where productivity comes in.
Looking back, do you think that if you were to rewind the clock, in terms of your career development and progression, if you have now gone back with the benefit of hindsight and had maybe worked at a lower level of intensity, less hours, let's say, do you think that you would have still arrived at where you are today? Because I mean, just very, very objectively, your early part of your career, that there were sacrifices that you had to make because you worked very hard. I think growing up, you were always flying, and then you've mentioned this in a previous episode, but there was once you had a bit of a wake up call because you were around one weekend, and I asked, why is Dad at home? Because that was not the norm. So there were sacrifices made, but a lot of those sacrifices have now allowed you the space and the time to be able to maybe have more times of reflection, more time with family as well. But do you think it would have been the same had you not have applied that same kind of rigor?
Truthfully, I think the answer is I went through that. It was necessary for my development. Because to use the term called, I need to explore. And that was the thing that really made me able to converge and focus on a few things. But I think that process of discovery was a necessary part of my own career development. Last week, your mom and I went to church and we had a guest, Pastor Philip Lin. And in his sermon on Sunday, he talked about gradually and suddenly.
Okay.
So when he said gradually and suddenly, he says, when people are going through a gradual decay in the things that they're doing as Christians, and suddenly everything is gone. It's not actually suddenly they are dead in their relationship with God, but it was a gradual process. They're not reading the Bible, they're not going to church, they're not praying to God, they're not obedient, and this is a gradual decay. But the moment they wake up one morning, they realize that their life is empty. But this suddenly is not the suddenly in isolation. It was a gradually towards a suddenly. In fact, the opposite. I mean, many things actually really happen in many aspects. So he talked about this idea of suddenly and gradually as part of the same thing. So if you like, suddenly, why did I suddenly come to this 6 secrets of leadership? It was a gradual process over a long period of time. I discovered the six secrets. It's a gradual, but it wasn't as suddenly I discovered it. It wasn't as suddenly, I didn't just suddenly discover the 8 step 2. It was a gradual process over a long period of time, what work and what don't work, that I put then this recipe, that the 6 plus 8. So I do believe that the message by Philip Lin, Pastor Philip Lin, was totally God-inspired. When he talked about the idea of how the 2 words, gradually and suddenly, are one and the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because just before we recorded this, we were kind of having a some pre-counsel before
Yeah.
beginning this conversation, and we had Mum who's just sitting over there watching this. We were having an initial conversation with her on this very topic, and we were talking about all these very like intentional blocks of time where we're resting, intentional blocks of time where we're being very intense. One of the points that she brought up, because we were talking about sabbatical as an example,
Right.
she said that, very realistically, some people might not have the luxury of a sabbatical, especially if it's an unpaid sabbatical, because you would have financial responsibilities as well, which might not allow someone to have that that amount of time. So, then she said, it's also important to think of what are the smaller pockets. And I think that's important, because if we have certain systems in place, certain habits maybe in place, those habits are things that can help us avoid that kind of gradual thing, gradual unhelpful habits and disciplines to creep in before a sudden end. And since we're talking about the topic of rest, something that has really stood out to me is something that we often teach at HTBB, the church that I serve at, and it's this idea of diverting daily, withdrawing weekly, and then abandoning annually. So what do we mean by this? I think to divert daily is what are things that you can put in place on a daily basis. Smaller touch points, like, so for you and I, it's music, guitars. For me, there's exercise as well. That is part of my kind of daily divergence, if you like.
From work.
From work or from stress. So you need to have these smaller pockets of things where you can divert. And I think the key is in the word divert, because you're not completely switching off from it.
Sure.
It's still there at the back of your mind, but at least for a moment, you have times where you can do something else that allows you to then come back to the task with a little bit more perspective. Then the next thing is to withdraw weekly. Withdrawing weekly, that can be naturally in our general work rhythms. We have a weekend. In the Christian faith, we also have this discipline of maintaining a Sabbath. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Sunday, but just ensuring that there is a time in the week where you are withdrawing. You're spending a bit of time. And you talk about the value of reflection. So this is a time for you to also be able to not just refresh yourself, but to also reflect. And, we often say, and this is very much the case, I think, in athletics, in sport as well, this idea that you don't rest from work, but that you work from rest. You perform far better having come from a place of being well rested. There's some unseen footage in this episode where you and I spent about a minute just now, maybe more so me, about 1 minute, kind of having a mental blank and not knowing what to what to say. And that was because both of us actually underslept for today's episode.
You didn't have enough sleep because you were
I was editing the episode that just went
Mine
live.
was self-inflicted because I watched Chelsea's game at 2:30 a.m.
And so that's where the withdrawal, the weekly withdrawal is important, because there's refreshment, there's also time of reflection as well.
Sure.
But then there's also the need to think, okay, on an annual basis, how can we find pockets where we can fully abandon? So this might look like taking a break, a holiday, and that can be varying lengths. It could be a shorter one, it could be a very long one as well.
Right.
But the idea here is that when you are taking that break, then you draw very clear boundaries, because this is penciled in, it's in the calendar, your whole team knows, you set clear boundaries that you don't want to be contacted during this time. So divert daily, withdraw weekly, abandon annually. And I think if we have these kinds of systems in place, they will really help us to avoid that gradual creep to the point of a sudden end. And maybe on the point of a sudden end, we might have to put a sudden end to this podcast episode, because I've got to go pick up Isla from school now.
Sure.
So this has been a great episode. Thank you all for joining us on this conversation. We look forward to seeing you next week. But before we do that, we just want to encourage you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel, both on YouTube as well as Spotify. We post episodes every Friday at 6 a.m. on both channels, but we also put up short form content on both our IG as well as TikTok at The Game of the Impossible. So thank you all for joining us this week. We'll see you in the next one.